everyone, Puneet here. Welcome to episode 17 of the North of Patient podcast, Conversations on Health Beyond Care. Today's guest is Dr. Jay Parkinson, a physician turned product visionary whose name many of you already know as the guy who started virtual primary care. Jay spent the last 2 decades redefining what healthcare could look like long before it was cool to do so. Back in 2007, on the very day that the iPhone was released, Jay launched the world's first house call practice powered entirely by smartphone. His practice went viral and changed the trajectory not only of his career, but arguably the direction of digital health. Since then, he's been behind some of the most influential ideas in modern healthcare delivery, co-founding Hello Health, Sherpaa, and leading product at Crossover Health. He's worked with startups, national health plans, and tech giants, always focused on designing better health systems around real human needs. And he has an incredible knack for design. In this episode, Jay and I talk about what it means to design healthcare like a service, what large language models are getting right and wrong, and how he's thinking about his latest venture, Automate.clinic, a platform that trains AI models with physician insight rather than replacing it. Jay has been a personal inspiration for me in my own entrepreneurial journey as a physician, so this conversation is something I've been hoping for a very long time. The links to the full episode are in the comments below. North of the Patient is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Substack. Subscribe on Substack to stay updated. And if you're enjoying the show, I'd love to hear your thoughts and your suggestions for future guests. Without further ado, here's episode 17 with Dr. Jay Parkinson. How you doing, Jay? So awesome to have you here on the podcast.
Well, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. It's a lovely day, lovely stormy day here in Boulder. So, happy to join you.
Yeah, so fingers crossed the weather doesn't get too crazy there. So listen, this is such a treat to finally chat with you. When we last spoke last week, I mentioned that I've been a follower of yours, if you will, lots of belief in your ideas with respect to virtual care for primary care, which you've been leading in that space. You've always been a step ahead of the curve with respect to where healthcare is going over the last decade plus. And while on this podcast, I tend to avoid bringing other physicians on simply because there's many avenues for physicians to have conversations about healthcare. I felt like you're really an exception to the norm, and in so many ways you embody kind of the ethos of what the North to Patient podcast is about. So quite honestly, it's a special treat to have you here, and excited to chat.
Thank you. And yeah, it's weird. It's a funny thing because, I haven't seen a patient in 18 years. So, I mean, I know I went to med school. I know I did 2 residencies, but I'm hardly a physician nowadays in the classical sense.
I know the feeling. I'm on sabbatical this year, focusing on the next startup, and sometimes it feels the same way because people that are in the trenches, it's a totally different reality, and I'm sure it's the same for you. You have colleagues, and you see what the day-to-day life is like in terms of just the difficulty and the personal toll that comes with patient care. So yeah, I feel like we should reserve the I'm a physician for when patient care is happening.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing is, for patients' perspective, it's you don't want to have brain surgery from a neurosurgeon that does one a year. You know what I'm saying? So yeah.
Absolutely. Um, So Jason, maybe we can start from the top, for the uninitiated, which may not be very many people, in terms of your life story and the very interesting trajectory that you've had, both through medicine and technology, the intersection of the two. Why don't you start just by talking a little bit about that career journey?
Yeah, for sure. So I've always just been a dork. I've always been interested in what's going on with technology out there. And it actually started with photography for me because Flickr was kind of like the first thing on the internet that suggested that the internet was super unique and weird. I've just been always paying attention ever since probably 2002 around what the internet's unlocking. And so weirdly enough, 2007 happens, and the day before my last day of residency, the iPhone was released. And so, I thought, wow, now all of a sudden we have a computer in our pocket. What if I could start a house call practice based on this little computer? So I moved to New York City from Hopkins in Baltimore and started that. And, it went viral. That was what was kind of weird about it. Got about 7.5 million hits on my site in the first month.
That was purely organic, or
Yeah, it was interesting. When I was in residency, I was the health writer for one of these new media blogs called Gothamist and Gawker. So I wrote for them. This is 2002, 2003, 2004. They were the ones that kind of set the conversation of what the local media was talking about that day. because they were the new hip, cool like media blogs, you know. So I was the
Hmm.
health writer there, and so they knew who I was. And when I launched my practice, they very much helped to blow it up.
Amazing. And then, so you had 7 million hits, and it sounds like the key idea there was being able to access clinical advice, a clinical visit through your iPhone. Is it safe to say that this was one of the first times people had encountered that idea?
Yeah, I mean that's what was so like I think novel about the idea, plus like why the news sort of glommed onto it. It was like, you know, young doctor, sort of Marcus Welby meets the internet, that type of thing. It was, you know, just right place, right time, right idea, and just kind of like an unlocking of opportunity because of that time and place.
And how disruptive was that to your, I guess, your career journey at the time from a clinical perspective?
Well, that was the thing. I mean, I knew I didn't want to do traditional practice. I also, you know, as a photographer at the time, a lot of my friends were just like the art kids or the baristas at the coffee shops. And you know, back then that was before Obamacare happened. So most of them didn't have insurance. And so my vision was to be like, okay, for $150 or so a visit, I can take care of that pneumonia for you, you know?
Mhm.
Plus I had like almost zero startup costs because it was just like, you know, a traditional kind of like house call practice that didn't have a physical place. So,
Mhm.
you know, it was a way to really take care of my friends and that sort of demographic.
Mhm.
And then also what I thought was interesting about it too is I kind of mapped out the sort of on brand services of New York City, so that if I did need to like care coordinate for my patients, I would just have a baked in network already that I
Mhm.
could just arrange care for. And also part of that was sending folks to a place that wasn't going to charge, you know, $1,000 and instead would charge maybe $200 for something. So I don't know, just keeping like an eye for just affordability in mind
Mhm.
rather than just like a concierge practice for wealthy folks.
Gotcha. And so where did that go? How did that scale?
Yeah, so out of that, we started a company called Hello Health. And it was around the same time One Medical was starting. So we
Mhm.
built physical practices, again, in those cool neighborhoods, Williamsburg and Brooklyn and the West Village in New York City, Manhattan. And, you know, it was a low cost subscription primary care online and in person experience. So, you know, that really unlocked the next phase of my career because we raised a bunch of money and gave it a go. And that was called Hello Health. And so Hello
Mhm.
Health's still around today. They morphed primarily into an EMR platform.
So this probably would have been like what, 2009, 2010, around then?
Yeah, Hello Health started in like 2008.
Okay.
So yeah, it's interesting though because you know the vision was to really be you know cash pay.
Mhm.
So when you think about what an EMR would look like if it did not have to bill insurance, that's kind of what we
Mhm.
were building.
Mhm.
The total addressable market for that is pretty small, you know. So Hello Health, the leadership did a great job, sort of like zigging and zagging and finding a great home for that platform.
Super interesting. Lots of parallels, obviously, with my career journey as well. My last company was Input Health, which was a cloud-based electronic medical record system in Canada. But when we started Input Health, there was no desire to actually build an electronic medical record system, an EMR. Everything was moving in the direction of saying we need, an EMR that does all these other things with respect to patient care, something that's actually focused on supporting care delivery as opposed to just billing and recording it,
Yeah,
right? Which is that kind of paradox we end up in today.
yeah.
But what would you say the receptivity was from the medical establishment around what you were doing at the time? Were you ostracized? Were you embraced? What was the feeling?
Oh no, I was definitely ostracized from day one. So, you know, the first probably 8 years of my career was like the industry calling me crazy and
Yeah.
saying like, you know, this stuff shouldn't happen. You know, we have to respect the doctor-patient relationship. But at the same time, you know, one of my favorite stories is like from Dr. Mooter's Medical Marvels, which is a book about Dr. Mooter, who's a physician in Philadelphia, who didn't really invent anesthesiology. He popularized it. And so he
Mm,
traveled up and down the East Coast to all the medical schools at the time and did surgeries in the theaters, you know, to be like, hey, look what I'm doing to this sheep. I'm like, you know, knocking it out and spending an hour on heart surgery on the sheep.
mm,
The surgeons at the time were like, I don't need that. I use my patient's screams to guide my surgery, and I can amputate a leg in 22 seconds. So, like, I'm the best surgeon you can imagine. So, like, even anesthesiology, which is something so insanely valuable to us, got, poo pooed in the beginning.
Yeah, it's something you don't think about, right? Right. Patient screams being part of the physical exam slash patient monitoring in the operating room. That's wild. But yeah, that's a great analogy for kind of how transformation's happening now.
Yeah.
So what happened after telehealth?
Yeah, so after Hell and Health, I met a guy named Grant Harrison. He was the Chief Innovation Officer at Humana. And we just really hit it off. We're besties to this day. This is about 2010. And he's credited with, gosh, creating basically customer loyalty programs. So remember back in the day, whenever you had like a key fob on your keychain and you would scan it at your local supermarket and they would like know what you bought? Um,
It
so,
didn't have that here in Canada.
oh, come on now. Like, but yeah, it was just like nowadays you just give them your phone number and you put it in,
Yeah.
and then now they move
Okay.
on and they give you coupons, right? So
Yeah.
somebody had to do that for the first time, and that was Grant over in the UK for Tesco, which is like the Walmart of the UK.
Hmm.
So as a young whippersnapper over there, he became basically like the grandfather of customer loyalty. So that's why he was head of innovation at Humana, because Humana was like, hey, can you make our members loyal to Humana? The point is, we got together and started a consultancy, and basically went around mostly the UK and America, to larger companies like Sanofi and Planned Parenthood and things like that. Again, this is 2010, so these folks really needed to, these big brands really needed to understand like what the internet meant to them,
Mhm.
and what modern consumers wanted. So we were like a consultancy for big brands on these two continents. So it was really fun.
How, how long did that go on for?
For about 3 years. And then I came up with an idea called Sherpaa, basically. And, he continued on, but focused less on health and more on customer loyalty across any sort of um, uh, industry. And then
Mhm.
I spun Sherpa out of that. And it was some of the best 3 years of my life, because in a lot of ways, it was just like I lived in New York City and I was back and forth between London and Paris, every
Mhm.
3 or 4 weeks. And it was just like, what a life. As like, you never would have, as a doctor in like, med school, if somebody would have said, hey, you're going to be back and forth between London and Paris all the time,
Yeah.
like you'd be like, no way, I'm going to be seeing patients. So amazing what like life unlocks for you sometimes.
Oh, 100%. That sounds like quite the adventure.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess focusing on those few years, what would you say the most tangible learning was in terms of what could be brought to improve healthcare? What would you say that would have been?
Yeah, I mean, like one of the things I'm really proud of was, one of my good friends in New York City was David Karp, who started Tumblr. And Tumblr at the time was like, really the coolest social platform that ever existed. And one of our clients, again, was Planned Parenthood of America.
Yeah.
So, of course, Planned Parenthood patients were the Tumblr demographic. So I basically connected the two groups and we built out Planned Parenthood's Tumblr strategy. So Tumblr at the time
Mhm.
had like an Ask the Author Anything feature. And so
Mhm.
the Planned Parenthood Tumblr got millions of like questions and they would publish their answers. And so it just became this repository of amazing like sexual health, um, questions and answers, and serving millions of people. So, like in a lot of ways, that was just so cool because it was just a perfect match of demographic plus like supply of like good medical advice. Again, just having that scale of being able to impact millions of people rather than like one patient at a time in a clinic.
I hear you. I hear you. And I'm seeing lots of parallels with kind of my career at that point in time as well. But prior
Mm.
to Input Health, I started a company called Polyarticular to polyarticulate, and obviously a little bit of play on medical jargon there. But the
Yeah,
idea was to improve the degree of engagement and the quality of content on social media that spoke to knowledge translation and preventative health,
yeah,
specifically focusing on populations that at that time, again, this would have been 2009, 2010,
yeah.
that were highly online, but then often not interacting with the healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, youth, largely speaking, you don't really go to see a doctor unless something's going wrong.
Yeah,
And
for
so,
sure.
how do we take the, evidence-based best practices around STDs, around depression, around the role of exercise and improving your long-term outcomes from your metabolic health, et cetera, from your brain health. How do we take those messages, make them sexy, and make them less, journalistic? And we
Yeah.
did that by actually partnering with young graphic designers and artists coming out of school.
Yeah.
Again, that same inspiration for what could we do to be able to address care to those that often don't get access to that, and that communication challenge that healthcare systems traditionally have in terms of being able to speak to people in a way that's beyond the immediate, doctor-patient relationship.
What do you think? Do you think it's gotten better or worse though? And in a lot of ways, I mean, what's happened in the healthcare system's ability to communicate with folks? Do you think?
Well, in my opinion, it's gotten so much worse.
Really?
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's funny because I was having this similar conversation with a colleague and talking about how we're trying to deal with medical misinformation on social media in 2010.
Yeah.
If you look at where we are now, it's hard to tell what's going on with anything information related.
Yeah.
And I think the volume of content about health in every aspect
Yeah.
is just, I think it's astronomical. And at the same time, the ability for people to actually be able to process that deteriorates. And we also have a loss of trust with the medical institution and with institutions in general. So
Yeah.
in my opinion, I think things have gotten actually a lot worse, especially in that social media realm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been experimenting with ChatGPT as like my own personal therapist, and like you gotta be really like on it. You need to instruct it to basically be, not so supportive of your thoughts and really challenging of your thoughts. There was an article in Wired not too long ago about how everybody's going to believe they're like the second coming of Christ because ChatGPT is so supportive of your own of the user's thoughts.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, that's fascinating. I think exactly what you're talking about. It's like getting more and more out of our control, which is a funny word too, because it's like we want control over information as doctors. And I think our profession over the last 20 years is like reckoning
Mhm.
that. And, obviously we're going to lose, but what do we do as losers is the best question, I think.
Yeah. And on that ChatGPT topic as well, it's interesting, obviously, because with recent updates to ChatGPT, most recent versions, there's been a change in the tone, and obviously, it's much more reaffirming to the user, much more kind of, I'd say, passive in a certain extent. And I think it's interesting because for people who are using ChatGPT in so many ways, including for the purposes of managing issues they're going through in life, self-therapy, it's funny the power they yield in making these adjustments and updates where unknowingly it might actually be destroying existing therapeutic relationships
Yeah.
and or it may be creating monsters of people because
Yeah.
of the way that it sort of can everyone think that the second coming of Christ, right? So it's like, is ChatGPT your preferred go-to large language model from the perspective of, you know let's say using it for personal therapeutic purposes? Do you notice differences between the different LLMs, and what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like I've been paying for both Claude and ChatGPT for quite some time now. So, I'm kind of used to being able to like just create my own GPTs and like, create my own instructions for them. So I haven't really paid attention to just like the free versions of these things because my understanding is that still you can't like, customize the free version, you know?
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, it's my go-to for the most part is Claude just because I think it's prettier. That's
Yeah,
number one. Number two, it seems to be kind of more accurate and communicates the way I do, I guess. But I'm sure
totally.
you train ChatGPT to do that too. So yeah.
Totally right. I think that's what they typically say. If you have a lower domain expertise in a specific area, then steer away from ChatGPT because it's obviously more likely to fabricate, but more likely to appease you. Whereas it sounds like Claude is less likely to venture into spaces where it doesn't know what it's talking about when from the perspective of the interaction. Um, so you said something really interesting there. Claude is prettier. There's this obviously importance of design, and design thinking permeates so much of what you've done. So how do you think that shows up in care delivery? Like, how do we think about the philosophy of design? I think you said something like design everything, it's all art. How does that apply to care delivery?
Yeah, I mean, to me, design is a process. I'm much more into like service design than anything. I think service design is interesting because it incorporates all types of design and incorporates, kind of the design of an interface, the design of a brand, the design of, just like how something works. And so I've just always looked at care delivery as a process that should be designed. And, right now it feels like a process wasn't really designed by anyone. And it's just kind of like, doing whatever the industry feels best rather than what the patient deserves. And I always approach everything from what the patient deserves and expects, given their experience with like other industries and how other industries are just so consumer centric, and healthcare has always struggled with that. So, my whole career has basically just been ripping off other industries and bringing it to healthcare. And, so in a lot of ways, more of like an observational cultural anthropologist
Yeah,
than a doctor.
that's an interesting way to put it. But do you find that there's a challenge with respect to the ability to actually be able to meaningfully design in healthcare when there's many immovable pieces, both culturally and from a regulatory and bureaucratic level? One of the reasons why so many attempts to be able to improve healthcare fail is because of that inability to design in healthcare.
Yeah, no, I never found an inability to design in healthcare. I think you find an inability to design at scale in healthcare.
Yeah.
But there's always been these little corners and pockets of healthcare in America, at least, I'm sure elsewhere, where you can just kind of do what you want. And
Mhm.
that's really what I've tried to build, is like stuff that doesn't play by the rules. And like the things that I've built touch about 500,000 people's lives, which is not nothing
Mhm.
today. But at the same time, there's 330 million other folks that are stuck in this like designless type of experience full of bureaucracy and obstructions. I mean, you don't get the traditional world to change without showing them a totally new way. And so the creativity in my career, I think, has been around how do you design a great service, but where do you design that great service? Who pays for it? And like,
Mhm.
who are the users that can be pretty loud about the experience that they have to influence the rest of our culture?
Mhm. That makes sense. And I guess one of the benefits the US has is obviously the availability of tools to be able to build and have that sandbox, but also just the sheer size of the market. I think there provides a little bit more opportunity to do that. In Canada, I do feel like it is more challenging, with the centralization of healthcare kind of within every province and every province having a different set of bureaucratic rules. It creates challenges. The experience that we had was with Input Health, and we built this entirely new way of thinking of the health record, the cognitive health record, and you know how it was when in its incomplete state, if you will,
Mhm.
was inspiring to a very different extent than how it evolves as it needs to comply with more regulatory requirements of what is an EMR and how are you going to get access to A, B, and C. And you kind of see the trajectory of it going from something truly innovative to kind of normalizing towards the mean while still kind of improving on some of those things.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the NHS in the UK has similar issues, right? But America, love it or hate it, it does have some pretty cool opportunities, and the opportunities that I've found have been in like the large employer space. So, for
Mhm.
example, like Facebook has 30,000 folks on their campus, and there's a 100 doctor practice
Mhm.
that's taking care of those 30,000 people. So, when you look into that practice, it's like, wow, this is the future of healthcare. But you have to
Mhm.
work at Facebook. Apple has the same thing, Microsoft, Amazon. They
Mhm.
all have these really internal little mini healthcare systems. When you think about Amazon and their, 1.1 million people, that's a little like, I mean, that's three times the size of like Iceland, you
Yeah.
know? And so
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting to think about them as like little utopian healthcare systems where you can like have a lot of freedom to do some really cool things for their employees.
Very true. And going back to your point of making it difficult to scale,
Mm.
as we know, attempts from each of those organizations to try to bring those models outside has been complicated, right?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to do that in that controlled environment, if you will, and then it's a hard thing to interface with all the moving pieces to make that work at scale.
But you know,
Um,
it's so cool. Like, okay, so personally, my partner has had some big health issues over the last month, and I've gotten to see her experience with Epic um,
mhm,
and the local University of Colorado healthcare system.
mhm,
And like, I'm kind of impressed. You know, I mean, there's a lot of patient messaging, there's a lot of care coordination happening, and none of that stuff would have existed without, like, folks like us
mhm,
uh, really pioneering what does communication look like outside of traditional appointments.
mhm.
And so it's been super cool to see that. And that stuff wouldn't exist without like people like us showing them that it could exist.
Very true. Very
So
true. I think you obviously have to have the space to be able to do things at the fringes as case studies, if you will, and then create that inspiration. So I guess going back to your journey, you started Sherpa, and then also Sherpa for those unfamiliar with it. How would you describe it?
yeah, I mean, prior to Sherpa existing, telehealth was like a 10-minute transaction between kind of strangers, mostly via video or phone.
Hmm.
Um, you can't really do a lot with a 10-minute transaction, especially if you can't continue that conversation with the same like team.
Hmm.
Uh, so those kind of transactions are related and are good for just like really simple things in healthcare, like getting a refill on a prescription or I have a sniffle, am I dying, that type of
Yeah.
stuff. So what Sherpa was a traditional medical practice just that was online. And so every time a patient needed care, they would fire up the app and they would work with the same doctor 90% of the time. And that doctor would treat that 3 week pneumonia as a project to be managed. And so
Hmm.
they were there to communicate throughout the ordeal. It wasn't appointment based, it was primarily asynchronous. And we ended up taking care of about 30,000 patients. Our clients were companies. Tumblr, of course, was our first client,
Hmm.
but Foursquare, Casper Mattresses, Blue Apron, all the like really cool startups of New York. And we just became the cool doctors for the very cool employers, mostly in New York, but we were actually in about 45 different states.
That's incredible. And hats off again to you for doing that. I mean, that's obviously set the framework for what we try to aspire to in terms of high quality, synchronous, asynchronous, longitudinal primary care. And then, and what happened after Sherpa?
Yeah, so Sherpa got acquired by a company called Crossover Health, and Crossover was they build physical practices on corporate campuses. So that Facebook practice I was talking about, that's a Crossover practice. The thing was, they were all physical. If you needed to see a doctor in Crossover, you had to go in to see them in the practice on campus.
Mhm.
And Scott, the CEO, and I, we just kind of agreed that hybrid care would be the future. So,
Yep.
talk online for the most part. If you need to be seen, go get seen. But they weren't a product company, so they didn't have their own platform that enabled this type of hybrid care model. So
Mhm.
Sherpa really provided the blueprint, and I became the chief of product to build out that platform for them. That's currently being used now by their about 1,000 doctors.
That was awesome. And how did you like that journey? Because it's a different environment to operate in, obviously, right, compared to running your own show.
Yeah, no, I mean it's hard, man. I'm more of a like 0 to kind of 30 employees type of thing rather than like, hey, you're in a company that has 1,000 employees. That's not my jam. So
Yeah,
yeah, I feel better in a place that you just can kind of build, with a clean slate.
totally,
But
totally.
the nice thing is too, like you don't know that until you've been in those experiences. So I think it's important for everybody to try out everything.
It's also, I think, helpful to see what works well in those environments and then what doesn't work as well, right? And kind of the complexities of people cooperating at scale like that. I think I had very similar experience. The last company, Input Health, was acquired by TELUS Health, which was the largest electronic medical record vendor in Canada. And
Mhm.
same thing, it was I mean, worked with wonderful people, but it's a very different environment, teams of hundreds, thousands of people. And at the same time, there's often a sense of like, there's a kind of the big brother corporation,
Yeah,
and there's always a sentiment that they have kind of nefarious goals or there's something malicious happening there. But then you kind of realize that when you're inside that environment, it's just that it's really hard
yeah,
to operate in an environment that big, and just the human processes of having to do things
yeah.
um, makes it challenging to actually be efficient and effective.
I mean, it's that, and also, I don't know if you've ever read the book Build by Tony Fadell.
No, I haven't.
It's great. I mean, he's the guy that created the iPod and the iPhone and then created Nest. So
Okay.
he knows what he's doing in terms of that. He also knows what he's doing whenever he's, in terms of acquisitions, right? So Nest got acquired by Google, and
Yeah.
it was an immediate culture clash. And the way he described it was there's institutional antibodies that come out.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
if you're the person that comes in and you're the change,
Yeah.
it's a totally different, weird set of like skills that you need to have
Yeah.
to navigate that versus like I'm a builder and I make cool stuff.
Yeah. So you were crossover then, and what came after that?
Yeah, so I took about a year off. I was at CrossFit for about 3 years, and I've just been gunning my whole life, and just needed a break. And so ended up moving to the mountains of Colorado and just hiking and biking and skiing and just living very cheaply and simply. I was like, I need to take as long as it takes for me to get really bored, you know? Yeah, to find the next big thing.
And where does that bring you today?
Well, in the meantime, after that year, I built a virtual primary care practice that was very much based on Sherpa's principles within
Yeah.
Sana Benefits, which is a health plan, mostly in Texas, but also again all over the United States. So that was cool to build like a virtual front door that was like layered on top of a health plan, and really to say to their health plan members, like, hey, you used to make an appointment for like a random doctor on this list. Now here's a really beautiful place to go and start your journey. And if we can't do anything for you, we can at least coordinate your next steps and be there with you throughout the journey. Um,
Mhm.
so we hired a bunch of doctors. We actually built the platform from the ground up to power
Mhm.
that. And so did that for about 2 years. And then in the last 6 months, I've been sort of ruminating on this idea that's eventually been called Automate.clinic.
Yeah, but tell us more about Automate.
I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it's the scale.com for healthcare. AI is a thing, obviously. The question is, can engineers build highly accurate AI without the involvement of clinicians? And I'm going to have to answer no, they can't. And so the
Mhm.
future of AI development is this collaboration between clinicians and engineers to make
Mhm.
AI models as accurate as possible. So other industries have done this really nicely, like Tesla, for example. You went from a pretty erratic full self-driving to now something that's like pretty impressive. OpenAI getting better and better, but that's also because it's been that combination of humans and
Mhm.
engineers. So Automate Clinic is basically just think of it as a medical practice, and instead of seeing patients, our doctors train AI models to provide their expertise so that they're as accurate as possible.
It's a fascinating model. I remember, I think I saw one of your first posts that came out about it on LinkedIn, and I had to read it a couple of times to fully absorb the magnitude of what you're building here. But I'm
Mm,
surprised that you're taking a totally different approach towards the problem and what's happening in this space. And I totally get it. I feel like you're the first one to articulate the thing that's needed in
mm.
order to be able to build next generation systems for healthcare delivery. So first off, just again, kudos to you. I think it's an amazing articulation of that. I really appreciate your writing and your thought leadership around that.
Mm,
Um, it's clinical reasoning, clinical nuance that's sort of locked into the heads of experienced clinicians, right?
mm,
Which is categorically something different from what's in a textbook or what's in a journal article or whatever the case may be. The nuanced thinking that's happening when you're making a decision between A, B, C, and D,
mhm.
and the clinical gestalt, if you will, that gets developed over time. Is that you're building an interface to be able to capture that? Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, I mean, the platform is, think of it as an engine that connects to a client's feed of
Hmm.
data. That data would be like AI outputs
Hmm.
from their model.
Hmm.
Um, the data would come in, and think of it as just like, oh, there's a new case. I'm a provider. I'm logged into the platform. I can go into a project. Within that project, I can go into a case. And that case is, think of it as a patient story. And, alongside that story is what an AI thinks about that particular case.
Mhm.
And then basically the provider starts interacting with a bot that has access to all the details of that particular case. And it's basically extracting how clinicians think about a particular case. And
Mhm.
then, structuring that as much as possible and then sending that back to the client that they can now use as super high signal data to retrain their models to make them more accurate.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I can't think of any place in healthcare where that wouldn't be valuable, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, w- what's been the challenge of this journey that's unique to Automate.clinic? Because again, like many times before, I feel like you are a step ahead of the space. So, what is that like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we only kind of like went public with the concept about a month ago. So,
Mhm.
I think the challenge is number one, articulating the problem. I think folks who are building models kind of understand the problem. I think there's also an interesting belief amongst engineers that, like, hey, we don't really need pesky humans, you
Mhm.
know? And so often what they're doing, though, if they do believe that, they're hiring like one or two doctors to do this on the side. And it's just like, it's hard to get doctors to do a lot and to extract that type of work from
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
Um, I mean, we're just basically creating, say it's a few thousand doctors that know exactly what they're doing, are bought in. They want a flexible lifestyle. They
Mhm.
like basically interacting with cases and, believing that they have sort of like outsized impact on a population
Mhm.
rather than just, one patient at a time. So, I mean, I think it's just kind of working with potential clients, connecting with them, and proving to them that like humans are actually probably your partners rather than the enemy.
Mhm. Mhm. And who are potential clients?
I mean, goodness, you name them. Anybody building an AI in healthcare, right? What's
Okay.
fascinating though, it's not just startups anymore. It's like traditional healthcare systems, and they have data teams and they have engineers and they're all trying to figure out what's the role of AI in a local health hospital network.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's becoming not just startups. There are about like 800 AI startups in healthcare right now,
Mhm.
but it's also the other 400 large hospital networks in America.
Mhm. And how does pricing work for something like that? So how do you build that relationship?
Yeah, the best way to explain it is okay. You could hire a doctor for 300,000 a year, or you could spend that on a team of doctors that are like 100% dedicated to solving
Mhm.
the problem. So I think it's that's the best analogy. But at the same time, again, what's nice about being in healthcare is like we're just so far behind other industries. Scale.com has figured out a pricing model that can be adopted for healthcare. So again, just kind of following their lead in a lot of ways to charge in models that make sense to engineering teams.
Yeah. And I totally get that. The interesting thing is physicians typically are non-technical from the perspective of understanding, and this is a generalization, obviously. There's so many exceptions to the rule. But at the same time, and engineers not having the clinical context, you can just imagine the mismatch between both people being set up towards the same goal, but unable to understand a the vernacular of of each respective world and
Mhm.
be what that meaningful thing even is. So I really see it as an interface between those two media that allows for that. So that's super cool. So what does success look like for Automate.clinic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on the kind of funding route that we go down. It's been pretty fascinating, the conversations I've had in this last month with, let's say government entities, investors, doctors, potential clients. The question is like, how big of a business can this be? And is it sort of a VC aligned business? Is it something that can kind of hockey stick? Um, and I'm increasingly thinking, yes, it can. So, if it's a VC funded business, what does success look like? I think it looks like, creating that unicorn that VCs love. And,
Mhm.
but doing it in a way that's like the company is AI first. And so,
Mhm.
back in the day, like you used to have to hire 10 people for the first year, and maybe you can do it with five now. It's, I love those stories where it's like, annual revenue divided by the number of employees. I think that's to me, how do you make a business that's hyper efficient and also just like a great business?
100%. Right. I think it's about punching above your weight,
Hmm.
and about doing more with less. And I think we're all after the same thing, which is really, can you get to value creation in as efficient a way as possible while minimizing the creation of bureaucratic structures that that suck the joy out of the whole process, right?
Real quick, what I think is also interesting is like the companies that I've built in the past, though, haven't been a great fit for VC. You know,
Hmm.
they're mostly just traditional doctor practices just online.
Hmm.
And so we ran into a lot of, butting heads of like, well, how do businesses and their investors behave whenever it's not a great fit? You
Hmm.
know? And so like it's been frustrating from my perspective as an entrepreneur who wants to build a great business, but
Hmm.
almost can't because there was a fundamental mismatch in like what the business like can and should be versus what the investors expect. And
Yep,
so now I think it's just, it's a different story because I think this is a business that like does fit well for VC.
absolutely. No, I can definitely see that. I guess taking it as an extension of that, what's exciting you right now in terms of what's around the corner with respect to technology and where you think these things are going to begin to interface with healthcare?
Yeah. I talked to a company this morning and they're building, gosh, what if Sherpa could exist if AI was like at its core? And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
What do these like front doors look like for care delivery? When, in the past, like Sherpa, a patient would have had to create an episode of care and write a paragraph and hit submit. And then a few minutes later, our doctors would read it. And then we'd fire off like 20 questions that we had built to fire off all at once. And then the patient would answer those 20 questions kind of all at once and send them back. But it's just like that's clunky nowadays. Now that you see
Yeah.
chat, you know, um, taking a history from patients. So, what does that look like? I mean, obviously, I want to see that because like that front door, virtual front door for primary care, has always been near and dear to my heart. So, I'm excited about just seeing what that looks like in the next few years.
Oh, absolutely. I think the possibilities are so vast. In terms of what that interface looks like for people as well, what band camp are you in? Because I know that people are kind of divided in terms of how big a role voice is going to play.
Mm.
What are your feelings about voice as an increasingly important interface to technology and AI and how that interacts with healthcare?
If you didn't have sort of like professional work, how often would you be on Zoom every day?
Oh, probably not at all. Pretty much non-existent.
It's funny
Yeah.
because like Zoom has taken on just like it's just kind of replacing the same amount of time that you spend in like a meeting in an office. It's this funny thing where like if you give people the freedom to communicate how they want,
Hmm.
the vast majority of them, I think, nowadays choose asynchronous for this more transactional type of relationship. However, when have big conversations, you want voice to happen. So then the question is like, how frequently are big conversations needed in healthcare versus just like day-to-day transactional status updates and things like that. So
Hmm.
big believer that primarily this is less voice and more sort of chat.
Yeah. I agree with the same. Voice is still clunky in so many ways, and I agree with you. Like I think in voice in so many ways is a commitment.
Yeah.
People don't like to make like extra commitments. I need to find a space and quietness, and I need to now articulate my thoughts in a certain way in order to be able to make this transaction happening. So the value proposition, I think, has to be great enough. And I agree with you. I think the reality is, at least for now, just the asynchronous interface of text is still, to me, going to represent a significant portion of the way in which we communicate in
Yeah.
healthcare.
But the cool part about it is like it doesn't matter anymore.
Mhm.
For example,
Mhm.
like my partner, she uses Marco Polo. It's basically like voicemail videos for your friends, you know? And so it's just she has this like endless list of like friends who are like speaking at her for 40 minutes sometimes. And you can kind of dive in and listen to these things, but that's how her friend group communicates with each other. The point is like it doesn't matter what form of communication people choose to use now. I mean,
Mhm.
with AI, like you can very much summarize, extract, like whatever. So what's exciting about I think this time right now is it's totally up to the user how they choose to communicate. The issue is like scheduling, you know? Do I schedule your time or do I do it whenever it's convenient for both of us and we can do it asynchronously, even though it's
Yeah.
like a video that I'm watching?
That's definitely exciting. And I think scheduling itself is going to be solved, obviously. I mean, the sheer amount of labor that goes into even like maintaining calendar links and schedule and all that, it's still super clunky.
Yeah.
And I can imagine, there just being a background agent task that reconciles priorities and it's self-adjusts and it knows enough about you to know what you want your schedule to look like and then kind of figures out the rest and moves things around as priorities change. But and I guess in terms of where you think where healthcare systems are not seeing the light, like what would you say would be some hard truths that healthcare systems need to see about what's happening right now and how we can effectively go from where we are to where we need to be?
Hmm. That's a good question. I mean, I think every healthcare system in the world, if you study them, I think they're suffering from the same thing, which is basically, it's not sort of digital native led just yet.
Mhm.
And until our generation kind of is in positions of leadership and decision making, I think we're still going to struggle with making healthcare great again, and like going back to the good old days. And in a lot of ways, it's just like I can't wait to see what they create. And I think it's going to be like one of those situations where it's like things change pretty quickly. I
Mhm.
don't know what that catastrophic situation will be, but I do believe that it's like there's a bit of a collapse that's going to have to happen before there's significant change.
Absolutely. And how about on the part of, I guess, the institutions of healthcare, whether it's nurses, pharmacists, physicians? What are your thoughts about how that evolves? Obviously, Automate.clinic speaks to some of that in the immediate future, but where do you see that going and what are the lessons we can impart there?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I would love to see is like very intelligent routing of like sort of all the tasks and communications of healthcare to the right like expert. You
Mhm.
know, you're seeing pharmacists here in America prescribing and managing patients now that are on like 8 different medications, whereas most primary care doctors just aren't trained well enough in pharmacodynamics to kind of have the expertise to manage 8 complicated medications.
Mhm.
Um, so they're turning that over to pharmacist as a service. Um,
Mhm.
and so they're treating pharmacists now as, specialists, just like cardiology, that can manage patients on the side with you.
Yeah.
So seeing stuff like that, I think that's great. Being able to call in different specialists like as needed, either in real time or asynchronously, really unlocks, everybody to practice at the top of their license.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. I've been a big advocate for the modernization and evolution of education around healthcare providers. I do think that we're not doing enough to be able to better prepare them for the versatility they need and skill sets for kind of helping them think a little bit differently about what a career trajectory might even look like. It's obviously hard to do that when truthfully, no one really knows exactly what things are going to look like in 3, 5, 10 years from now. But I feel like more could be done to build in that resilience and kind of bring things back to why are we doing the things that we're doing to begin with? As a family doctor, what is the thing that I could uniquely provide here that's differentiated enough that makes me really valuable to the healthcare system? And then as long as you do that, as long as you can actually be valuable, I do believe that you'll figure out how to plug in and tap into whatever's happening. But
Yeah.
if you can't articulate that and you kind of just, rely on, I guess, institutional history around, well, I'm relevant because this title makes me relevant. I,
Hmm.
I feel like that's going to be the big challenge for people to actually be able to hone in on where value lies.
It's interesting. You mentioned family practice, and there is a disproportionate amount of family practice docs signing up for Automate.clinic
Yep.
compared to the other sort of specialties. And I think that's fascinating because what is the challenge there? Are they struggling to articulate sort of their unique value and therefore checking out and just trying to find something new? So I think you're hitting on something that's really interesting. Going forward, the importance of your profession is going to be how well the profession articulates exactly what they do.
Exactly. And on the primary care point, my perspective is as somebody who's practicing as recently in family medicine as last year, I think the squeeze that's been happening on the amount of output expected relative to the amount of, I guess, reward for that, whether that reward is, recognition, compensation, other flexibility, set job satisfaction, that squeeze has just been immense. And I think it's just leading to people sort of feeling like I'm doing more for less.
Yeah,
And I'm just don't have job satisfaction.
yeah,
And I think that's the big thing. You don't feel like you're contributing to something bigger.
yeah.
And in so many ways, I think even from the perspective of builders, folks such as yourself and myself, where we've tried to bring value to healthcare systems and we've often worked with healthcare providers in the context. It's interesting because I feel like so many times when we're talking about, come onto this new platform and this new way of doing things, it has less to do with the cerebral understanding of rationally why this is meaningful and
Mm,
so much to do with the emotion of I want to be part of something bigger and I want to be part of a solution and I want to feel valuable. And even if you're licensing, if you're signing up to an EMR, if the EMR can make you feel valuable because you're not participating in the future,
yeah.
that in and of itself is totally different from all the bells and whistles and other things, right? I mean, I feel like an Automate.clinic kind of captures that too.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I think doctors want freedom and flexibility. Um, what was so fascinating about Sherpa was 90% of our doctors were moms with like 4-year-olds.
Yeah,
They just wanted to be home with their kids, and they wanted to be able to work, and they wanted to be able to be flexible. And so flexibility is super important, but meaningful work is the other one. That's super important, man. It's just like if you feel like you're part of a sinking ship, that's professional depression, right? So I think that's where a lot of doctors are right now. And then finally, I think docs want just like intellectual, challenges. They want to like not deal with like pink eye after pink eye all day. It's more
yeah,
about like what are these really weird cases that I can like kind of solve because all doctors want to be the smartest person in the room.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Everyone wants to be Gregory Hess, right?
yeah, totally.
Awesome. Well, Jay, any kind of parting thoughts? Anything else you wanted to say or add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we covered so much today. I'm excited about the conversation.
Likewise. And I guess one last thought or question for you in terms of things that are inspiring you outside of healthcare. What's something you're finding is a source of optimism and inspiration?
Um, a little, a little going back to the root of what it means to be human type of stuff. I think the conversations around like loneliness and relationships and the importance of sort of best friends and good communication. I think we're going to start sort of rebelling against all the progress that doesn't make us feel good and go back to like the roots of what it means to connect with other humans. So I'm excited about that. I think it's a slow process. And I think it's every generation is going to react differently. But I think, seeing what the youngsters are doing nowadays and sort of connecting in real life because online life isn't as fulfilling, I think is really promising. Again,
Yeah.
it's just pockets of this stuff happening. So it's not like this is a big you know,
Yeah.
revolution or anything like that. But that just gives me hope.
No, I share that enthusiasm for that perspective. I think the positive fiction in all this is really that we're acutely aware of the downfalls of the hyperconnectedness and the excessive interface to technology that we've developed today, whether it's through social media or through other environments. And I think this promise of being able to get to a state of invisibility of the technology
Mm,
and the removal of the things that block us from creating human friendships and human relationships and actually facilitating those. And I'm optimistic that everyone's beginning to recognize that right now. So hopefully we build solutions around that too.
yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for this conversation, Jay. I really appreciate it and looking forward to getting feedback.
Hey, definitely, me too. Thanks for having me on, and can't wait to hear it.